This episode of Crosscut Talks is supported by Alaska Airlines.
Hey, welcome to Crosscut Talks. I'm Mark Baumgarten, the managing editor for Crosscut, and today we're talking about America's reckoning on race. It's been just over a year since the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers, and last year at this time, the streets of Seattle, like so many other cities across the nation, continued to serve as the stage for ongoing protests against racist policing. The anti-racist movement spread from there, hitting pretty much every institution in the country. Promises for change came from all corners. But where are we now? That is the question that we wanted to answer during our monthly Northwest Newsmakers event. We invited two black men, who occupy different roles in the fight against racism in our society, to provide some answers. Doug Baldwin is a former wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks, and he is also an advocate for criminal justice and education reform. You'll hear him in the first half of this conversation. For the second half of the conversation, we'll bring in Shaun Scott, who is a writer, filmmaker, and organizer. Talking to both of our guests today is Monica Guzman, the host of the Northwest Newsmakers series, and I've got Monica here to give us a little insight into this conversation. Hey, Monica.
Hey, Mark. How's it going?
I'm good. I really enjoyed this conversation. I wanted to ask you, this is a big topic, of course. It's been very much all-consuming in the last year. Why were we talking to these two guests? What did these two guys bring to this conversation?
So they brought insight into a dynamic that sits at the heart of every push for change. And on the one hand, it's the difference between performing change, paying it lip service, and actually making it happen. And then it's also about going out and demanding change, protesting, and then actually encoding it into policy. So Doug, our former wide receiver / pretty amazing and active, advocate for all kinds of things around our community and nationwide, he was there, right, when the NFL was going through its struggles, accommodating its players' passions for racial justice and other kinds of movements. And he got to witness, in other words, that tension between performance and change. Are institutions just paying these things lip service? Or are they, and can they, and is it even their place to begin to advocate and house those sentiments themselves? And he is, before this conversation, I heard a lot about Doug. Famously frank is how we described him in our description, and I think that listeners, you will see that Doug is quite frank and quite passionate and really interesting to talk to. Now, Shaun, as an organizer and an activist, very proud of all that means, and also a very considerate thinker. He goes deep. He goes very deep on things, and he works in policy. So with him, it was about that tension between protest and policy. Lots of folks in Seattle and around the country were out on the streets. But how many of them understood what it takes to make the change they were calling for actually part of our nation, right? And so there's a difference between calling and demanding and then doing. So that is why we had those two gentlemen on the show.
Interesting. And we had a good audience for this, and they were very active, had a lot of questions. What did the people who were watching this conversation want to know from these two?
It comes back to that same feeling that there's this urgency for change. Most of the audience questions were trying to turn that need, that call into something tactical. Yes, but what do I do? Yes, but how do we get there? So it wasn't so much arguing the finer points of these movements. There was something that really, rumbled and roared at the death of George Floyd, which was, of course, about much more than the killing of one man. It was reckoning. I love that word, right? Because a reckoning means that we have to grab at things in tension and we have to figure out some really nuanced things. So it was a lot of trying to make these things tactical. So toward the end of the show, you will hear Doug and Shaun come together to answer these questions, and you will start to see how their different experiences overlap and intersect in trying to address what the listeners want to know, but not really fully being able to get there because this is a big this is a big topic, and we're not going to get the answers from these two gentlemen. We're going to get it somehow organically from all of us.
Okay, so what was your takeaway from this conversation, Monica?
Yes, I almost told you what the takeaway was in answer to your previous question because I was kind of on my way, but I knew you were going to ask me. So the takeaway is that this is a process. There is always, again, this urgency for change. Can we just solve it? Can we just solve it now? Can everyone just get on board with this or that or the other? It's difficult to acknowledge, even though something feels so urgent, that it still has many layers. And you'll hear from Doug and Shaun all kinds of pieces of those layers. They really go deep into it. You'll hear Doug come back and back and back to this image he has of ultimately how we're just human and we need to see each other's humanity, even across big divides, even to folks who seem to resist for all the wrong reasons. Are we sure? Are we sure about their reasons? Can we ask more questions? So that was it. Shaun is a historian and has done, long films about Seattle's history. And I left the conversation thinking, oh yeah, this is just one step in a long history. And it's going to be very important and critical that we are present for this moment, but also all the moments that come next. And that we understand that it's not going to be resolved in a moment, not a year out from George Floyd's murder, and maybe not even 5 or 10 years out, but that we are taking steps, and it's a process.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing that perspective and that behind-the-scenes look at the conversation, Monica. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
We hope you enjoy the conversation. If you have any feedback, please send it to talks@crosscut.com. Okay, on with the show.
So let's start with how you've seen the events of the last year. Do you see the world differently since George Floyd's murder? And if so, how?
Do I see the world differently? I don't know if I see the world differently. I think I see the world as, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but as it's always been. I think we've always been in this perpetual state of trying to seek progress, trying to seek justice. And, because of advancements of technology, we've been front and center of a lot of the issues that we have been talking about, that our society and our culture has been talking about for many, many years. And now we're just seeing it. We can't get away from it. We can't hide from it. And so, I guess I don't see the world differently. I see because of the technology and because of the direction I feel like our culture is shifting, I think there's great opportunity.
Opportunity for, how would you articulate what you're hopeful for?
A culture shift really is what it comes down to. I probably sound like a broken record to people who've heard me speak about this, but I've really been diving deep into culture and into leadership. And, I don't like to talk about my previous career too much, but there's some relevant context that I pulled from that. Like, I've been on championship winning teams before, like from little league to high school to college to pros. And I know what it feels like. I know what it feels like to be amongst a team of people who genuinely just care about each other. And I think if our culture can kind of adopt some of those character traits, what kind of society will we live in? What kind of world will we live in when we see something like, the murder of George Floyd, and we all collectively know that that's not right. And we all collectively move in a direction to change the way that our society operates and engages with police or any other infrastructure or system within our society. I think the opportunity there is that, we have an opportunity to change the culture and the way that we look at each other, right? Like, we're all human beings. And so if we can adopt that mindset, I don't know, maybe there's great opportunity there to change things that haven't necessarily changed in the past 400 years.
So I want to talk a bit about your background. Your dad is a police officer and has been for a while in Florida. So you've had a front row seat to that job your whole life. What comes up in your conversations with him about police reform that don't tend to show up in discussions, let's say, on the political left or the right? Anything he wishes more people would understand from that point of view?
Yeah, I think number one is that there are so many different precincts and so many different municipalities, and how they approach training is all different, right? There's no federally mandated training protocol, right? Everybody does it differently. My father, to your point, he spent 35 years in the force in Pensacola, Florida. And, 35 years, you can, especially in the South, you can imagine all the experiences that he went through, right? As a Black police officer. And one of the things that we spoke specifically about, several years ago when this topic first came up in the NFL, was his belief in the proper training of de-escalation. And they called it verbal judo in his training. And basically it was like, the essence of trying to de-escalate a situation. And so I took that information from him, and then I started looking around the country, and, quite honestly, specifically here in Seattle, and it was very different than what I was hoping to see, right? And so that's what I took away from him, was that, there's a lack of consistency throughout the country in terms of how police are supposed to be engaging with the citizens of their community.
And are you seeing some of that consistency come up in the last year, or at least feel more possible? Or do you think that that's even the path?
Let me clarify.
That consistency is part of the solution.
I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's like, the consistency, when you say consistency, there's so many different definitions of what consistency would look like, right? Like, what implementations of verbal judo or de-escalation tactics is consistent for various precincts, right? So I don't look at it in that sense. I look at it kind of the underlying foundation. Like, there's got to be a culture shift, right? We have to start looking at human beings differently. And I think if we start there, right, then the consistency or the congruency and tactics across the spectrum might start to line up more. But I think the underlying problem is that we have a culture that looks at human beings differently for different walks of life, different experiences, different colors, right? I think that, to me, that's the fundamental problem, is that we don't have a foundation of looking at human beings on this planet that's tumbling through space, everybody just trying to survive and thrive on this rock. That's the culture shift I think we need to have before we can see consistency in anything.
So turning to the NFL, it looks very different today than it did when you retired, even in 2019, which was not that long ago. Or when Colin Kaepernick got on the league's bad side by kneeling during the national anthem. Since then, the league has said Black Lives Matter. It's put tens of millions of dollars into its social justice initiative. It's allowed movement-based messages on the field. How does it feel to watch these changes happen now? And have they gone far enough? I think I know the answer to the second question.
I would be lying if I said that it didn't feel that it honestly just feels surface level. It just feels surface level. And we all know what that feels like, right? During these past few years, there have been businesses and organizations who have put out, messaging, but we as a community who, have dealt with this for years and understand the underlying emotions, like sometimes those messages come back hollow, right? Like it's not a depth of understanding of empathy. And, I'm not saying that the NFL is doing that. I'm saying that it does feel like that at times. I do feel like they are trying, right? I know people within the larger organization that are trying to really push some initiatives and being very thoughtful and intentional about, how they're showing up in these spaces and in these conversations. But I will say, it's just at the end of the day, it's a business. And the NFL knows that the majority of their viewers come from rural areas who don't necessarily want to see politics and entertainment. And that's really hard for them to, to do the dance of and dance around. I do think that there's some level of responsibility that the NFL is feeling. But again, I don't know how high up that goes. And I'm just hoping that, as we continue to evolve as humans on this planet, that culture shift will happen and we'll see more of that really substantive and depth of messaging come from organizations like the NFL.
Yeah, you mentioned it's a business at the end of the day. It's entertainment at the end of the day. And the limitations that puts. So I want to ask about that institutional side. The day they announced the guilty verdict in Derek Chauvin's trial, you tweeted one word: justice. So what role do you see institutions built for entertainment, like the NFL, realistically playing in the ongoing pursuit of justice, especially around race? And what role do you think they cannot play because of these limitations that you've just mentioned?
Well, I think the role that I think they can play is just being honest. I think that's probably my biggest issue with the entertainment industry is that, instead of being honest about some of these conversations, again, like they're trying to dance around it, right? But like, shit, this matters to a great deal of people. This matters to people who have lost their lives, who have family members who have lost their lives, who are dealing with this on a consistent daily basis and, to some degree are fed up, right? Like we can get into a large conversation about this, right? Like even the narrative about defund the police, right? Like I don't necessarily agree with the term defund the police because I do believe like we still have sex trafficking. We still have people who are murdering people. So we need police for that. But I understand the concept and the thought process that goes through, like, you can't reform that culture, right? I understand that emotional response. And so—
Meaning you can't reform that culture, so you have to try something deeper. Is that what you mean?
Correct. Yeah. Correct. And when you say try something deeper, I think what that really means is just reflecting internally. Like we're all human beings. Regardless of the color of my skin, I am a human being, right? We live on this planet that's in space, that's tumbling through space, right? Like, again, I can go forever on that topic. The point is that in the entertainment industry, I think being able to reflect on that, to really be grounded in the truth and the honesty of who we are and what we are as a society and as human beings, I think the messaging and just the initiatives and the dollars, where they go, all that stuff would start to change. But again, it's the depth of the culture shift that we need.
There's a quote: "The difference between a mob and a movement is the follow through." And if my research is correct, you heard that from sociologist Dr. Harry Edwards first, and then you said it when the Seahawks locked arms during the Star Spangled Banner in September of 2016. When you look around at institutions beyond sports, beyond maybe entertainment, where is the follow through not happening? And you've been talking about this deeper internal reflection that's needed, this deeper culture shift. So feel free to tap into that and take us with you, another level down.
How much time we got? Okay. Let me put it this way. I'll use a sports analogy, right? Like, again, going back to the championship culture that I was a part of, that I've been a part of for many, many years. It's like there's no incentive for you to individually do well, Like, you don't care about the individual statistics. You don't care about the bottom line, right? It's not about the bottom line. It's about the impact that you have on the people that are within your organization, but also the customers, the clients, the patients, the whoever that you touch that's outside of your organization, right? And, you know, as in the sports world, it's like, in order for us to be successful, in order for us to win, like, we could not care about stats. You couldn't care about stats. You had to care about the guy next to you. You had to do your job to the best of your ability, not because it was going to get you paid or it was going to get you affirmation or because it was going to get you fame or celebrity. It was because you cared about the person next to you. That's it. You know, and, you know, I know there's some Seahawks fans on here, and if you go back and you watch the film, like, you can sense it, you feel it. You know, one example is they called it Beastquake 2.0. Marshawn's running down the side of the field at Arizona, and if you watch the tape, you see Ricardo Lockett come into the frame, sprinting his heart out to go get another block for Marshawn. That's the effort that I'm talking about. That's the culture that I'm talking about. You know, Ricardo was not getting, he's not getting extra dollars to go make that block, right? He's doing that because he loves Marshawn. And that's the culture shift I'm talking about. So now to your question about what is not happening, I think that's not what's happening, right? Like, these hollow messages, they're really just pointed because you know, their bottom line is being affected. They're worried.
Are people looking at the stats? Like, to connect the dots, you said you can't care about the stats. You have to care about the guy next to you.
Right.
So pull that back out, right, into the larger fabric of what's happening.
Right.
Is that what makes things feel inauthentic or dishonest?
Yeah, it feels like people are worried about the bottom line rather than just being human, you know? And if you get it wrong, that's okay. That's human, you know? But just being willing to fumble through it and to be in the mess and to be in the trenches of trying to figure this out with the rest of humanity, you know, that's where I think that's where it's missing. You know, I do applaud some organizations that I think are trying to do it, right? But I also, you know, just quite candidly, I also see other organizations and businesses feeling really hollow about it.
Mm-hmm. Can you name an organization? You were saying that you see some that seem to be getting that right. Can you name one for us? Not to put you on the spot. It's all right if you didn't have one in mind, but
I know. Let me think about that some more.
Yeah, that's cool.
There's one at the top. There was a commercial I saw not too long ago, and I was like, "Oh, that's very thoughtful and considerate." But I don't remember what company it was. I just remember the feeling that commercial made me have. So let me come back to that.
Cool. All right. So another quote for you, because you are into leadership and culture, and this comes from that world, from author Ken Blanchard. There is a difference between interest and commitment. When you're interested in something, you do it only when it's convenient. When you're committed to something, you accept no excuses, only results. When it comes to eliminating racism, wherever it exists in America, which institutions do you see making excuses? And which do you see achieving results? And maybe we can focus on either one.
That's a fun.
And feel free to name like industries or spaces, but just, you know, places maybe where the attention should be.
Well, I honestly think the education system has to address this in some manner. If you look out at what's happening in legislation across the country, like, there's an attack on the institution of education and trying to address some of these concerns, right? Like, there's an effort to expand the curriculum in teaching about the importance of our history, right? And where we come from. The Zen Education Project, right? Like, I know it's a hot topic in a lot of places, but you know, as an African-American male who grew up in this public education system, there wasn't an emphasis on curriculum that spoke to me, right? That represented me. And so now I'm out in the world having to figure out, you know, my historical context in the midst of all this noise that really doesn't pertain to me, right? And so I think, to answer your question, there's a number of institutions that I think have some responsibility and some role to play in addressing the issues of the day, or I shouldn't even say the day, of our history. But I think our education system needs to take a broader approach, a more methodical approach on this topic. Now, that being said, I don't think teachers get paid enough as is. So there's a lot of problems already there. But that's where I would start.
So speaking of racism, going a level deeper, the focus with police reform tends to be on Black Americans. Your mother is Filipino. Does or is it your grandmother? I think maybe both.
Yeah, my grandmother is full Filipino, so that makes my mother half.
Got it.
Yeah.
Does your background expand your sense of who's most impacted by police accountability?
I mean, you know the answer to that question. I think, look, there's a large population of law enforcement officers and representatives that are white. Just say what it is. And there's a culture that doesn't understand the other culture that necessarily they're policing, right? We know this in a number of facets, right? So we know that there's officers who police communities that they're not from, that they don't know about, that they have no experience in engaging with the humans that make up that community, right? That's a problem. If you don't know the people that you're serving, then how can you properly serve them, right? So yes, and because I have the cultural background that I have, I would like to say that I see it from multiple viewpoints, multiple perspectives, and I do think that. I think that there's in some instances there's a case of a lack of trust for institutions like law enforcement, right? There's a lack of trust, and then there's just the blatant hatred towards that institution because of the historical context, right? So I've been a part and seen multiple facets of it while also being in the South. I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, which is a more conservative area. And so I also saw it from that perspective, right? And again, like at the end of the day, it's all these humans trying to blend together for the same purpose of just thriving on this planet, but yet we don't see it that way. And the vision is, I'll stop there because I could go on for this for hours.
So I'll end our segment with one more question for you. You've said that your faith is your foundation. How has that faith shaped your view of the struggle for racial justice in particular?
The core sentiment is love your neighbor, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter who the person is that you're looking at. They're your neighbor and love them, right? Flaws and all. And I think, just that perspective in regards to race, to class, to sex, to sexual orientation, to everything that our society discusses today, it doesn't matter. It's like, that's your neighbor. That's your fellow human on this planet. Love them. Love them for who they are, flaws and all, cultural differences and all. And I keep, broken record, culture shift. That's really what in my personal opinion, that's really what it comes down to. Now, I know that there's some nuance to that. And I know a lot of people probably think like it's way more complicated than that. I disagree. I think really it takes us as human beings to reflect on who we are on this planet and to really force the culture to shift by acting in accordance to that belief, which is love your neighbor, regardless of who they are, where they come from, what they look like. Love them.
So I lied. I'm going to ask you one more thing.
Okay.
What's one of the projects, because you're working on a lot of things, what's a project you want to mention real quick, and we might come back and explore it more in Q&A, that you're excited about?
I don't know. I'm working on a lot of things. One of the things that I am working on right now is I'm building an investment company. I'm taking a very slow, methodical approach to it because number one, we're building a culture internally first, so that when we go out and it is a for-profit entity, but we operate like as a nonprofit. We don't care about our bottom line. What we really care about is the social impact that we're making. And so I'm really excited about it because of the culture we're building internally as an organization. and the thoughtfulness that we're going to carry out into the spaces that we enter. So I'm really excited about that. More to come on that.
Awesome. All right, with that, Doug, we're going to say goodbye just for now. We'll see you again at the Q&A. But for now, we're going to turn to our second guest, Shaun Scott. So Shaun is a writer, a filmmaker, organizer, a member of the Seattle Democratic Socialists, and a policy and field campaign manager for the statewide Poverty Action Network. He's also the author of Millennials and the Moments That Made Us, and his upcoming book from UW Press is Heartbreak City: Sports and the Progressive Movement in Urban America. So Shaun, hi, welcome to the show.
How you doing, Monica? It's good to be with you and good to be with Doug as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you were able to make it today. So you've been an organizer and thought leader on the left, in particular in Seattle, for several years now. When George Floyd was murdered, what, if anything, shifted for you in your sense of where you should put your focus and your energy in your work?
Well, I think I had the same reaction that a lot of folks who have been organizing for and advocating for police accountability had. It was much the same interaction that I had had a couple of years prior when Charleena Lyles was killed here in Seattle. Indeed, much the same reaction as a native New Yorker that I had when I watched what unfolded with Amadou Diallo in New York City, Abu Luima in New York City. That it felt like every few years we kind of had this referendum of these highly, very, very visible and egregious police killings of African Americans in specific, and that was sort of leading to many of the requisite calls for reform. As a writer and as a thinker, what I sort of try to challenge folks, and I think what I was challenging myself to see in the last year, is how is it possible that we can have recurring events that have such similar details down to the official narrative that we get from local police departments as far as the killings of unarmed African Americans, but we keep finding ourselves repeatedly in the same situation. And so I think there are a lot of folks, and this was something that I think a realization that I came to, that gradually the conversation maybe needed to shift from reform, maybe indeed even on from accountability, to the notion of abolition. And that is a progression that I think a lot of folks have gone through.
And can you define abolition in this context for our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have had multiple abolitionist movements in this country for many years. We had an abolitionist movement in the 1860s to end the institution of slavery. Michelle Alexander points out in her book, The New Jim Crow, that in many ways what we have with the criminal injustice system is an extension and a continuation of those forms of racial subordination that existed previously in the Jim Crow South. So when we talk about abolition, we're talking about severing the link between contemporary policing, contemporary so-called criminal injustice, and the institution of slavery. The fact that you can be somebody who, is imprisoned and you are not subject to many of the constitutional rights to the franchise that folks who are not embroiled in the prison system have, suggests that there is a link between that old institution of slavery that we thought we turned our backs on and the era of mass incarceration that we are currently living through.
So on that note, you've said that when challenges are drastic, solutions must be radical. What then are your sort of radical solutions that you kind of dream of and wish would happen to the drastic challenge of racial justice? And maybe it's connected to abolition, maybe it goes beyond.
Right. So to be radical is to grasp an issue at the root. And I look at the fact that in the local example, we're speaking to you from Seattle. In the local example, we have had a police budget that has increased on the order of 36% in the last 5 years. $407 million in 2020 were slated to go towards the Seattle Police Department. That is a number that is greater than the city of Seattle's investments in housing, childcare, parks, zoos, libraries, and aquariums combined. So that if we're talking about building healthy communities where people are not subject to having to commit crimes of poverty, the solution that grasps at the root of that condition is one that says, why are we investing X amount of dollars in the traditional model of public safety, when so much of community has gone underinvested in, can we actually get better health outcomes, better economic outcomes, better social outcomes through a frank conversation about resources and how we are spending them within our cities? And that's just the city example. We could talk about state as well, but as a Seattleite, somebody who's lived here for the last quarter century, that's where kind of a lot of my focus happens to be at this point, is looking at budgetary decisions that we are making civically at the local level.
So you've said that it helps to understand people's anxieties around an issue if you hope to drive change around it. So looking at folks who are resistant to the changes you push for, anything around abolition or anything beyond reform, whether it's economic policy, police, et cetera, what to you then are the genuine anxieties that you sense behind those? What are the concerns there?
Mm-hmm. So I think as Black men, and Doug spoke very eloquently to this earlier, I think coming from communities that are more likely to be subject to over-policing and to militarized policing, these are deeply rooted anxieties that I know my parents trying to raise a young Black male in this country had, whether or not it was me or somebody who I know or one of our members of our family that were going to be the latest story, the latest hashtag. And I think that it's very, very hard to overstate. And I think many people in this country don't quite understand what that does on a chemical level to walk around with that level of fear. And I think it kind of explains a lot of the reaction that we saw in the last year to the killing of George Floyd, that people were not necessarily reacting only, each life is precious and each life lost in such a fashion, especially, as a tragedy. People were reacting as much to that individual tragedy as they were to the collective tragedy and indeed the collective trauma of having to operate and live, work, raise kids, go to school with that hanging over your head, that could be a possibility for you or somebody that you love. So I think that's where the anxiety, or the conversation around the anxiety, sort of starts for me. And that's, I think, a lot of what I try to advocate and organize for is rooted in addressing and ultimately alleviating.
Well, what about the anxieties for folks who would sort of be opposed to your approach to what the solutions could be? So, folks who say, no, I don't want anything to do with defund police or abolition or anything radical. It's just not okay, not something that I can, imagine. What kind of concerns or anxieties do you see backing that up in folks?
It's such an excellent question. And the reason why I appreciate it is because the notion of abolition has been treated with such scorn and cynicism over the last year. The folks who identify as abolitionists often do not get the opportunity to articulate and spell out what exactly this means, and also to address the very real and reasonable fears that you call attention to. I would look at the fact that, there was actually a Crosscut Elway poll that ran that showed that the majority of Seattleites, for example, supported some example of shifting or civilianizing, I should say, the 911 response that we currently work with. That doesn't really seem like, on the surface of it, a tenet of abolition, right? But when you look at it, it actually kind of is, because it's the idea that there are resources that are being apportioned that could go elsewhere, that there is a response, community responses that don't necessarily deserve or need a gun with a badge. Folks who are having mental health episodes, folks who are subject to houselessness, who don't have access to the amount of treatment that they would in a different social setting. So I maintain that there is actually much more agreement on this issue with respect to, some of us might be coming at it from a certain viewpoint as organizers and as avowed abolitionists. Others, just want to make sure that they have healthy and invested in communities where a 911 call doesn't necessarily mean a story on the nightly news. And so I think the onus is on folks who are making this case to make sure that we're bringing as many people into what I think ultimately is going to result in a healthier and more safe city and more safe society ultimately.
It's sort of what Doug was saying, where at the end of the day, we're all humans hurling through the space and trying to thrive.
Right, absolutely.
And all these different ideas.
Absolutely.
So you joined the Black Lives Matter movement as an activist in 2014, and then you saw Trump elected president 2 years later on your 32nd birthday. Your work bridges the worlds of activism, which pushes for change, and then policy work, which tries to embed that change in society. Mm-hmm. Where is that transition from protest to policy toughest in your view?
Well, it was a lively November 8th, 2016, to say the least, watching Trump get inaugurated and seeing, what many thought was the unthinkable. And I think that there are thousands of folks like me who are in a similar situation where, they felt that business as usual couldn't kind of continue on the way that it had, and that we were entering into a very desperate era in American history where collective action was going to be required. I'm somebody who in a lot of ways felt, I don't know what the word for it would be, but I felt a way, let's say, watching the storm, the storming of the Capitol and the Stop the Steal sedition. And to know that, there were at least 6 Seattle police officers that attended this sedition spoke to the larger breakdown in trust that I think we've been talking around between communities and police. And so there do have to be policy solutions to address this condition. It always is going to come back to me, to the way that we're allocating our resources, the priorities that we have for affordable childcare in the city, the priorities that we need to have for affordable housing, the priorities that we profess have to be backed up by actual investment. Doug talked a little bit earlier about what it looks like to have a shallow commitment to racial justice and to economic justice. From the NFL, which I'm sure a lot of former players could talk to you about how that's going with how they're treating the players union. But in the very localized example of talking about how the city is interacting with some of its most vulnerable citizens and most vulnerable workers, I think it needs to be a budgetary commitment to back up the rhetorical commitment that we have had for many years.
So I want to pause real quick and remind our viewers that we'll be doing the Q&A in just a couple of minutes. So if you haven't submitted your question, I'm sure you have many. You better have many. This is a fascinating discussion. Please get them in so we can consider them for the latter part of our show. So Shaun, to close us out, looking at your work is sort of going from sort of one deep dive to another. You do a lot of long form. You've done book-length studies on millennials. You did this documentary on Seattle's history, and you keep kind of bringing it up in your work, going back to look forward, which is really fun. So imagine then that it's 10 years from now. What question about this moment today would you be working on a deep dive around?
Well, I hope that the next time that I have the opportunity in 10 years to join a similar conversation with Crosscut, that we're talking about the tremendous strides that we took civically to address racial justice, and that we're not talking from the vantage point of the opportunities that we did not make the most of. It's one of the reasons why I find history so fascinating, because it takes a lot of pressure off of you, honestly, to know that there are certain recurring struggles that have happened over and over again. The responses, emotional responses that you might have, policy responses, political responses, those have been played out in various different contexts. So we have the opportunity to learn what worked and what did not. Moving forward in 10 years, I hope the conversation that we're having is one that talks about, man, can you believe that we had gotten it wrong for so many years, and that actually all it took was 2 or 3 years of sustained, or 4 or 5, or maybe 8 or 9 or 10 years of sustained commitment to undo a lot of those structures. That's the conversation that I want us to be having in, I guess that would be in 2031.
Mm-hmm. And we'll be looking forward to reading your book about that.
Hopefully it doesn't take 10 years to write. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll be back with more after this message.
Ready to take your travels to the next level? Alaska Airlines is committed to providing a higher standard of safety and cleanliness throughout your journey. From mask requirements and touch-free options to HEPA filters on board and everything in between. Plus, their award-winning loyalty program, Mileage Plan, makes it easy to earn and redeem miles wherever you go, including destinations worldwide, thanks to their One World Alliance membership. If you're ready to land a low fare, next-level care, and the best experience in the air, book now at alaskaair.com.
So before we get to our Q&A, I want to make it a party and bring Doug back on screen. So we're going to get all three of us here. There we are. So again, thank you both so much. I think this conversation's just generated a lot of really interesting themes and topics, and both from the head and the heart. So really appreciate that. So first, I'm going to ask a question to both of you that was submitted ahead of time from John Hayes. He asked, what is the hardest part about being a race and justice leader and spokesperson?
Well, Doug.
Go ahead, Shaun. You can take that one first because I need time.
I would say, in my limited experience, one of the most difficult things is, the hard part is that you're arriving at certain conclusions as a result of being very, very close to folks who are most impacted by those social issues. It might take many years before that reaches a critical mass in folks that are a little bit further from, for example, we've been talking about police violence in particular. The question of poverty, no less important and intersects. The question of, Doug brought up education. There are many people who are closer to the folks who are most impacted by these issues. It can take many years before it reaches critical mass towards folks who are a little bit further from that to buy in. And in that interim period, you have to realize that the struggling and the organizing that you're doing is about bringing people in. It's bringing people in. It's bringing people in until that critical mass has been built, which does not emerge overnight. It happens as a result of a lot of work that does not happen in front of the camera. So I would have to say sustaining through that part where it feels like you might be laboring in obscurity or laboring and speaking to folks on ears where folks are not listening to you necessarily. But knowing that, with that work that happens in the background, that it's going to reach sunlight at a certain point.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And, I think from my experience, the hardest thing is being in conversation with those who do not see it, who don't recognize it, and who don't understand it. I have friends and even family that don't see it from that perspective, right? And it's really hard to be in conversation with them because, to John's question, as a quote unquote leader, right, there's a certain expectation that I even have upon myself. I want to be a representation of the foundation that I believe in, right? To love your neighbor. So even these people who don't necessarily agree or even can see it from this perspective, I have to be the example for them to see that there is a different perspective. There is a different way, right? And when you're in conversation with those people who, just don't want to see it from that angle, it's a really challenging place to be. But I think as leaders, we are called to go into those spaces, just like Shaun said, and build that critical mass. And the only way we do that is by being in relationship, engaging with those who don't necessarily see it from that angle. And you said a quote earlier about interest and commitment. I think the commitment begins with interest, right? So to me, it's just, I need that effort. I need that effort. If I'm going to expect that effort from somebody else who doesn't understand the perspective that I have, I also have to provide that effort into being engaged in the conversation with them. And I believe that's the only way we build that critical mass that Shaun was talking about.
So here's a question from Dan Saltman. After resources are reallocated to community priorities and abolition otherwise, what is the optimal response to violence in the community? So Shaun, you can kick us off, but I'd love to hear from Doug as well.
Yeah, well, we have a number of law enforcement agencies that stem not just from local police departments, but also upwards to the county through the state, federal law enforcement as well. The question of response to what we are going to necessarily do about violent crimes, which is a very important issue. At present, actually 60% of violent crimes don't actually end up ending in any kind of conviction or trial. So there's quite a bit of leeway or give between the amount of funding levels that we have traditionally advocated to the present model of public safety and the outcomes that we have gotten in return. And so I would point to the fact that many folks are calling on public safety models sort of after the fact of a crime, and that we can work and collaborate at different and higher levels of government to address many of the safety concerns that might exist in the community. I will say this: I think currently we have a lot of law enforcement that are handling issues that have to do with parking enforcement, that have to do with petty crimes and misdemeanors, crimes of poverty, and that maybe with many of those kinds of responses that should not be criminal off their plates, maybe there would be a lot more that law enforcement, a different model of law enforcement, would actually be able to focus on if these are the real deep-seated anxieties that folks have around what we could do in a world without policing. It has to do with prioritizing, for many folks who believe that we need a public safety model, prioritizing that 911 response.
Doug, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say, I think progress is always going to be a process. So even if we reallocate funds to community needs, those community needs will change. Our communities always change. We're always evolving. And so, being receptive and open to those changes as they come and having that conversation, I think that's one way. And then the other way, in terms of mitigating violent crimes, we're going to have violent crimes. Okay, that's just we're human beings. It's always going to be a part of our culture, unfortunately. But what we can do to help mitigate that is do something on the preventative side of things. So I spoke earlier about teachers having a lack of funding. Why don't we start focusing more on that level and the education, the public education realm, where these kids are entering into these spaces and they need more services, they need more attention, they need more time, they need more love, right? And again, I know that word can be touchy-feely to some people, but that's genuinely what I believe in. If we really want to solve some of these problems, we have to be looking at it vastly differently. Just like Shaun said, more radical responses to this. And I know the word radical can be weaponized, but when I say radical, I mean, let's actually look at human beings and start loving them for human beings. And maybe we'll start having some solutions to these problems long term.
So a question for Shaun: is there any commitment to create a bridge between progressives and moderates to become a greater coalition of the willing? I think you addressed this a bit earlier, and that comes from Connie Summers.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think, Connie, what I would say is that we have so much political will and so much visibility around what it means to be a progressive in this city. And the aims of being somebody who's a progressive are aims that very few people would disagree with. Where it comes down to Connie mentioned moderates in that solution as well. I think that that's the work of relationship building. That's the work of making an inclusive case. That's the work of saying, you can call yourself a moderate, but the concerns where you have around, wanting an affordable place to live, wanting to have childcare that's very accessible, wanting to have healthcare that's readily available. Those are concerns that I think most people would actually end up sharing. So really the onus is going to be on folks that maybe are bringing up a little bit more of the vanguard, if you will, and who are pushing on these issues to make sure that we're building a case that's an inclusive case. And I think more people than moderates, I might add, would actually buy into a vision that's expressed in an inclusive fashion.
So that's actually a perfect segue to our next question, which I'll throw to Doug, and then Shaun, if you want to add to it. This comes from Kelly Lloyd. How do we convince the right to embrace racial and social justice? And there's, so I'll just let you guys go for it.
I mean, isn't that the age-old question for years and years and years? I think, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's just engaging with the other side, engaging with the opposition that doesn't see it from your perspective, being in relationship with them, being in conversation with them, showing them your humanity. That's really what the people who don't see it from that perspective, they already have a preconceived, built up mindset of the way that they see things. And the only way that you change that is by engaging with them and showing them that it's not that. Mm-hmm. And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time and a lot of patience and a lot of strength. And I hope that we are resilient enough as a community, continue to push through that, because, again, in my opinion, that's the only way we're going to build up that critical mass.
Shaun, go ahead.
Yeah, I look at this from the vantage point of one specific issue that I think there would actually be a lot of common ground on, and it is the issue of civil asset forfeiture laws, where presently in Washington state, whether you are convicted of a crime or not, if you are merely a suspect, local police departments actually have the ability to seize assets that they think are tangentially related to a crime that you may or may not have committed. Not only cash, but also bank accounts, real estate, consumer electronics. If you're somebody who's coming at this from a right perspective, or if you're a libertarian, property rights are sanctity in the United States. And so the idea that a government agency of any kind, if you have not been committed of a crime, could be able to seize certain amounts of property, 90% of those assets, that revenue can actually go back to local police departments. So it creates an incentive to actually to prop up, in a sense, certain amounts of criminal activity as we've defined it, because there's profit in it for local police departments. I don't think that's an arrangement that would work for anybody on the left, and certainly not for somebody who's on the right, definitely not in the center. So that's a case that needs to be made among these and other issues to show, if you're somebody who values property rights, if you're somebody who values the rights of the individual, if you're somebody who values free speech and the right to assembly, that there's a certain amount of police conduct that you would be forced by the compulsion of those convictions to be critical of. And I think that's the way that we would have to go about making that case.
So I know you both value nuance, so I want to ask a follow-up question to that question, which is what do you think can be learned from the right? There's this powerful assumption that the right is against much of racial and social justice, but it may be more complicated than that. What do you think can be learned from perspectives on the right in this movement?
I think, there's a clear indication of fear from some component of the right's historical context that makes them feel compelled to be against social change in that way, right? And I think it's also, it's relevant to us now, because those of us who are on this side of the spectrum, like, there's a rational fear of interacting with law enforcement. Like I feel it even in my neighborhood. A police car walks by and I'm like, I have to put on this, I feel innately in my being that I have to put on this smile, like I'm not doing anything wrong, and I don't want my daughters to feel that way. And so, I recognize that there is a fear there. And so being able to take a step back and say, okay, this fear is getting me to react a certain way. What is the fear on the other side that is getting them to react that certain way? And if I can empathize with them on a human level and then speak to that and engage in that and have a conversation with that, then maybe there's a bridge that can be built that understands that the fears are very similar. At the end of the day, we all want to go home safely to our families and to our loved ones and be seen out in our communities. Talking about nuance, I think that's really kind of the essence of what I'm trying to speak towards, but also what I see in our communities is much needed.
Right.
Go ahead, Shaun, if you have anything.
I really think you also look at, and there's so much value in what Doug just said. I mean, I think also about the fact that the right in this country has sort of understood very well what organizing means, and what, running candidates who share your viewpoint at, the level of school board, council, governor, dog catcher, state legislature, and the act of building power to advance a vision for society is something that I think, frankly, the right has understood for much longer than many folks on the other side of the divide. And so I look at that as a to the spirit of your question, as something that I think a lot of folks could stand to emulate, that if we were similarly committed and similarly civically engaged, we would see very, very different outcomes that even those on the right would come to enjoy. and perhaps agree with, the world that would be built from, the engagement of more progressives and folks on the left in our elections and in our political system.
So we're going to close out with one more question. And this, I think, ties together a few things we've been talking about. So why does it seem as though everyone wants equity, but they don't seem to want to talk about culture? Curious how you might interpret that. Doug, you've been talking about culture a lot. Do you want to kick us off?
I think honestly, it's that we don't know how to define culture, right? It's just, how do you define culture, right? From different perspectives, different walks of life, how do you define culture? Equity, you can't have culture without equity. Like, everybody has to have a part and a role in the culture. And, again, I'm going to take it from a sports perspective. I'm a huge basketball fan, right? I know this is going to make some people mad, but I like LeBron James. I really, really like LeBron James. And the reason why I like him is because he builds a culture on the teams that he plays with. The man's been to 10 finals for a reason. And if you just watch the games and his teams, he's building a culture. And what that culture really is that everybody knows their role. Everybody knows their role. If LeBron is driving to the hole and he kicks it out to the corner to KCP, LeBron can look the other way because he trusts KCP to knock down that open three, right? But I think that's the same conversation that we're trying to have about equity and culture. Like, that's the culture we're trying to build, where I pass the ball to you and I trust that you're going to do the right thing with it, because it's your job or because you're going to make money because of it. It's because you genuinely care about me and the rest of the team. You genuinely care about your neighbor. And so when I pass you the ball, your equity is that's your role. Your role is to be in that corner and knock down the three. And we're all counting on you to do that. And so, I think the problem is that we don't understand how to define culture to that level. And if we do, if we can get to that point, then we would all understand our equity, our role in that culture.
Shaun, bring us home.
Well, Doug has just passed me the ball here. I promise I'm gonna try to not break this.
So many sports analogies.
You're right. In bringing up LeBron, he's also one of the first athletes to don an "I Can't Breathe" shirt. He was somebody who spoke out, had all the Miami Heat, I think it was a team that he was on at that time, wearing black hoodies in solidarity with the Martin family after Trayvon Martin was killed. And I think a lot of folks, to something that Doug had mentioned earlier, would really like to see a world where sports and culture are escapism from certain political concerns, but with a new generation of Black athletes, a new generation of athletes generally, not to leave out our Black and brown and white allies and comrades in this movement, have sort of realized that there's no turning away from it. And if you're going to turn on a game and enjoy what the brilliance of Black and brown athletes looks like on the field, you're also going to have to get a taste of the experiences that they are bringing with them to the game. And that's enough to make some people want to turn off, but it's also enough to make a lot of people tune in and get a certain amount of deeper empathy and deeper cultural experience than they would have gotten if it was just business as usual and just playing games. So that's a point that I really appreciate and appreciate being in this conversation so much with Monica and with you as well, Doug.
Thank you both so much. That was a very rich conversation. I wish it could go on longer, but thank you both so much for being here. Appreciate it.
For having us.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thanks to Doug, Shaun, and of course to Monica for the talk. And thanks also to the folks in the audience who asked questions. If you'd like to be one of those audience members for a future Crosscut event, go to crosscut.com/events. This episode of Crosscut Talks was engineered by Chi Lee. The live recording was engineered by Resty Bacall and Victoria Ralph, and the event was produced by Jake Newman and Andrea O'Meara. Catherine Burby managed our audience engagement. If you'd like to subscribe to Crosscut Talks, you can do just that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. And if you would like to support the work that we do at Crosscut, whether it's the live events we host every month or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/donate. Crosscut Talks is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Mark Baumgarten. We'll be back soon with another conversation.